You see this thing, the Yomaim Rosh Hashanah and the Mishnayot? So this is a Mishnah. This is the Mishnah on Shabbos. It's talking about circumcision for a child born as Shabbos is coming in. There's situations where the child is circumcised either on the 8th day or the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, or the 12th. What does Gemara mean by that? It sounds like, by the way, people start studying the Mishnah. It talks about when are you going to read the Megillah. The Megillah reading is 3 weeks from tonight, God willing. So it's going to be, a few days of Adar are eligible. So these are, it says no earlier, no later. You're going to circumcise a child on the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th day. No earlier, that's certain. And no later, even though actually there are exceptions. For example, if you were to buy a slave child, and he's only 2 days old, the day you bought him, that's when you circumcise him. And then, of course, child for health reasons who has his bris delayed, now he could be much later than 12 days from when he's born. This is talking about assuming no medical emergency and no extenuating circumstance, a child is still naturally going to be circumcised on what they call day 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12. How's it go? Kedarko Lishmona. Ordinary circumstance, child will be circumcised on day 8. How do you calculate it? Well, if he's born on Halachic Tuesday, he'll be circumcised on Tuesday morning. What's the line? Well, the line normally is sundown, but as we said before, sundown is not the line here. Why? Nolad ben Hashmashoth mimolat Tisha. If he is born already, once the sun has gone down, now it's ben Hashmashoth time, so he'll be circumcised on day 9. What do they mean by day 9? They mean day 9 from the time before ben Hashmashoth, which is either day 9 from the outgoing day or day 8 of the incoming day. Basically, he's pushed to the incoming day. So really, if he's Nolad ben Hashmashoth, or even after ben Hashmashoth, we call him Nolad Latisha, but after ben Hashmashoth, that would just be back to Nimo Lishmona, circumcised on day 8. Why do they mention it using this funny language? Why don't they just say born after sunset? The answer is ben Hashmashoth Erev Shabbos Nimo Lasara, because he's born on ben Hashmashoth, twilight of Erev Shabbos, he is to be circumcised on day 10. Halacha explains this. How does it work? I'll say it outside. If he's born as Shabbos is coming in, ben Hashmashoth, day 8 for him would be next Friday. If he was born on Friday, that would be good, but he might have been born on Shabbos, so he'd have to be circumcised on Shabbos, day 9. And that's what would be if it had been any other day of the week when he had been born. But because Shabbos is coming in, and now he's sort of a suffix, you can't circumcise him on Shabbos, so we push off the bris to day 10, which would be Sunday. Okay? Day 8 was maybe the day he's born. Day 2 is maybe the day he's born, Friday or Shabbos. So day 10 is Sunday. That is when he's to be circumcised. Basically, circumcisions that are remotely doubtful, even if this could be their proper time, they are not performed on Shabbos. Like I said before, the Rambam, the only time the Rambam considers ben Hashmashoth a doubtful time, as Rabbi Rabinovich pointed out in his commentary, and as you could find if you just read everything the Rambam ever wrote, and he mentions these halachas, normally sundown is the line between days. But with regards to Shabbos, it is not. Somehow, ben Hashmashoth kicks in. Why? Because the Gemara says so. When the Gemara says ben Hashmashoth is suffix of the day or suffix of the night, like the Rambam himself, he understands the Gemara is saying it's never suffix. We always consider sundown to be the line. But for Shabbos, it's different. I wonder if it has something to do with my Sabratius, by the way, that there should be lack of clarity with regards to this. Okay. But, maybe that's something we should look into. Yom Tov Lachar Shabbos. Let's say Yom Tov is going to be after Shabbos. Nimo Lachar Asar. This type of bris that's doubtful doesn't override Yom Tov either. So Yom Tov is Sunday. This child will have to be circumcised on Monday, which would be day 11. Friday is day 1. So next Friday is day 8. He's born as day 1 is ending. It could very well be day 2. So he could be circumcised on day 8 or 9. We would do 9 to play it safe, but 9 is Shabbos. So we do it on 10. 10 is Yom Tov. So we'll bris him on the 11th. And here's where it gets interesting. Shnei Yomim Tovim Shel Rosh Hashanah Nimo L'Shnei Masar. If it's Rosh Hashanah, that's after Shabbos, okay, which is a 2-day yontif. So You're going to have 3 days, a 3-day yontif as they call it. You can't circumcise them on Shabbos, neither on those 2 days of yontif. So the bris will be on Tuesday morning. Nimo l'shnei masar. That's the 12th day. 12th day counting from the Friday, the end of the Friday from which he was born. Friday might be day 1, or maybe Shabbos is day 1. So we'll call Shabbos day 2, Friday is day 1. And he should have gotten brised on Shabbos day 9, me out of doubt. Why? We couldn't bris him on day 8, which is the Friday, because maybe he wasn't even ready for a bris. Maybe it's not day 8. So we'll bris him on Shabbos. No, but now it's a doubt. So we'll push it off to Sunday, and then to Monday, and finally to Tuesday. That's what the Gemara says. Sorry, that's what the Mishnah says. So far, everything is works out well here. Which, by the way, this Mishnah is a proof to what? Something we were arguing earlier this week. Astute students will know that the Mishnah here talks about the typical case of a child born in Benish Mashos as Shabbos is coming in. Because children are born all the time. This happens often enough because women give birth at all sorts of crazy hours. And every week in Jerusalem, there's a child born like this in one of the hospitals. This is a regular occurrence that a child is born as Shabbos is coming in. It's quite typical. And Bein Hashmashos is quite a long time. We see that, according to the Rambam, for example, Bein Hashmashos is basically like 18 minutes or so. According to the Vilna Gaon, it's shorter than that. But the Vilna Gaon, the Bein Hashmashos is a significant amount of time that it brings up this question. Let's say Bein Hashmashos were to be an instant, okay? 1 instant every Shabbos. Then this wouldn't be so much of a question. Like, as a child born at this instantaneous point in time, this question would basically never really come up, that it would have a Mishnah describing all the various permutations of the consequences thereof, right? So let me ask you, is there any opinion out there, or anybody listening, is there any opinion out there that holds that Bein Hashmashos is actually infinitesimally small, or an instant? And the answer is 3, 2, 1. No one interjected. Rabbi
Yes.
Yossi. Oh, what? So why don't you say so? Rabbi Yossi's opinion.
Even
What does Rabbi
according to
Yossi hold
his
about Bein
opinion,
Hashmashos? Anybody want to say it? No? Okay.
it's
Fine.
Keharafine.
Oh, Rabbi Yossi says it's Keharif Ayin. So how would Rabbi Yossi deal with this Mishnah? Or someone asked me, why don't you have it? There's all the cases and all these things are talking about against Rabbi Yossi. Why doesn't the Gemara say Tiyufta de Rabbi Yossi? And the answer is, we actually have, like the Rambam you find in his Perush Mishnayos, there are a lot of opinions that are in the Mishnah, or even not in the Mishnah. This opinion of Rabbi Yossi is found in a Brisa. It's not even a Mishnaic position. This opinion of Rabbi Yossi doesn't have to be Tiyufta. The Rambam makes note of a lot of opinions that come up in the Mishnah that's, we don't hold of Halacha. You don't even have to bring it to Yufta sometimes. It just doesn't fit. And the Rambam will say there's an opinion here that it's a singular opinion, and we don't follow it because a lot of Stam Mishnayos elsewhere do not follow this opinion. Correct? You don't have to go around actively tiyufting, or what's the proper word? Refuting or showing how certain Mishnaic and Tanaic positions are not held of la halacha. Okay? But this Mishnah assumes not like Rabbi Yossi. And by the way, who holds of this Mishnah, this explicit Mishnah, which is, by the way, Stam Mishnah. It's not a Tanakama. It's not just Chachamim and Machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. This is a Stam Mishnah that's brought as halacha. Everybody assumes this is halacha. This is the operative halacha. There's a Machlokas at the end of it. But this is an operative halacha that cannot be resolved with Rabbi Yossi's position concerning what? Bein Hashmashos. Why? Because, like you can discover by reading the Rambam, Rabbi Yossi's opinion is basically not held of like halacha. It's basically impractical. Why is it impractical? Because lo nit Torah l'malchei hasharis, and for many other reasons. The sages assumed here and in many other Mishnayos and many other explicit opinions that they implicitly did not hold of Rabbi Yossi's idea of Bein Hashmashos. Does that make sense? Yeah, should be. That should be good enough. Either way, let's see what the consequences of this are. The Rambam is going to talk about why it is that the Gemara mentioned, so the Mishnah mentioned, the 2-day Rosh Hashanah, as opposed to any other Yontif. So he says here, if you want to understand this Mishnah, He tells you that Ben Shmashos is Safek Min Hayom Min Halayla. Okay, that's our position he has regarding Shabbos. And Mila, that's not in its time, doesn't override the Shabbos or Yontif, because the Mila is an Asay, and Yontif is an Asay and a Lot Asay. And he also points out here that there's an Ikar Etzleinu. I put this in blue. This is the Rambam's position. Ki Shnei Yamim Tovim Shel Rosh Hashanah Bilvad Shein Kedusha Achav. Rosh Hashanah has a 2-day. It might be observed as 2 days, but they count as one Kedusha. That is, the second day is just as holy as the first day. The Rambam is implying that in the other Yom Tovim, it's 2 separate Kedushas. The first day is of a lesser status than the second day. It's a suffix day. It's not really the Yontif. By the way, the Rambam says, why was Rosh Hashanah mentioned? Because that's the one that has one one holiness. It's like one long day elsewhere in the Gemara. So that's what he says in Hilchos Mila. He says over here that such a Mila, child born Ben Ishmashos, as Shabbos is coming in, so next week is going to be, nope, not on Shabbos, not the bris. What about the next day's Yontif? Not Eno Yodoche as Yom Tov Rishon. The bris is not going to be done on Sunday, which is Yontif Rishon. Docha, it's feminine. Docha Yom Tov Sheni. We'll be able to do the bris on the second day of Yontif. Uvishnei Avim Tov Yusha Rosh Hashanah, Eno Docha, Eina, should be Eina. Very funny. It does not override the first day nor the second day. So the Rambam is reading this at this Mishnah is saying, yes, this is halacha regarding Rosh Hashanah specifically, but not other 2-day yontifs. The din would be different if it's some other 2-day yontif, let's say in Chutz La'aretz. That's why the Rambam said this. The Rambam is saying that that's what the Mishnah is teaching you, because yontif Rosh Hashanah is a kedusha of some sort. It is both days are equally holy, and it's as though the second day is an extension of the first day. That's the Rambam's explanation of this Mishnah. And the Rambam's explicit opinion that comes from this Mishnah, I marked in blue. But the Torah doesn't have it that way, for example. The Torah says, actually, there's a machlokas here. Beis Yosef will explain this machlokas. And the Vilna Gaon will actually, he gives a slightly different explanation. You have to actually see this and wonder, what was the Vilna Gaon implying? I think that his implication is kind of clear. What is it? Over here, the Torah says, Kol milah she'ena docha Shabbat, gam yom tov eina docha. Any circumcision that does not override the Shabbos doesn't override Yontif. And the Rambam says, Kothav Rambam, Dauka Yom Tov Rishon Shegaliyot. The Yontif that's not overridden by the circumcision is the first day of Yontif in the exiles, in the diaspora. Aval Yom Tov Sheni Docha. But a bris on any other Yom Tov Sheni, yes, it would. Have you seen this before? Do they do brises in New York on the second day of Yontif if the bris is questionable? The answer is no, because they have different opinions. If it was the second day of Rosh Hashanah, then the bris would not override the Yontif. Yontif wins. Vadoni Avi Rosh Zal, my father, the Rosh, wrote in one of his chuvas, the Mila Shelo Bizmano, a Mila that's not in its right time, that let's say doubtful ones, and Adocha Afili Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galiyot. Any Mila doesn't override Yontif Sheni of the diaspora. So this is actually a machlokas, the Rambam and the Rosh. Those are the main opinions here. The Rosh's opinion, the more, severe opinion, or the more stringent opinion, is marked in red. The Beis Yosef explains what the Rambam wrote in the first chapter of Hilchos Mila over here that overrides the Yontif Sheni of Galos in the diaspora. Ta'amo milo ashkach tana nimo yodbet elodafka b'sheni yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah. The reason the Rambam said this is, in the Mishnah over here, it says that in such a case, the Mishnah explicitly mentioned 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. It didn't say 2 days of Yontif. It said 2 days of Yontif of Rosh Hashanah. That's when you push off the bris in such a case. But if it had been any other holiday, perhaps the bris would have been performed on the second day of the holiday, which would have been Monday. That's what the Rambam is going with, and it makes sense. And he mentions, but the Rosh wrote in his tshuva, Klal Kavav, that's where you can find it. Dikar Gabi Meiti Tiru L'Chlod Yom Tov Sheni. Well, he does agree that with regards to burial of the dead on the second day of Yontif, that is true, that is permissible on Yontif. And even on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, everybody agrees to that. Aval, if it's a bris that's already been delayed for whatever reason, like this one, it was delayed to after Shabbos because Shabbos could have been the right day, but it's doubtful, so we didn't do it on Shabbos. Now we got pushed to Yontif. Loi tiru livchot yom tov sheni bishvilah. They never had a heter to also override the second day of Yontif for this meal. If you're going to say, well, the Mishnah specifically said 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, that's not overridden by the bris, this particular bris. But maybe 2 days of some other Yontif, like Sukkot or Shavuos, that's the more common case. Shavuos is usually on a Sunday, for example. Our Sukkot is never on a Sunday. Our Rosh Hashanah is never on a Sunday. So what happens? Ein raya de mafnifin yishneit be'eretz Yisrael. The Rosh would say, it's not the only reason the Mishnah mentioned Rosh Hashanah specifically is because that's the 2 day Yontif that exists in Eretz Yisrael. But they wouldn't have mentioned any other Yontif because in Eretz Yisrael they only have 2 days. Sorry, they only have 1 day for every other Yontif. The Rosh is saying the only Yontif that's recognized in Eretz Yisrael that's 2 days in Mishnaic times is Rosh Hashanah. But the question that we can now ask is, wait a second. Are the Mishnayos like that they only give the Eretz Yisrael style of halacha and they don't describe what exists in Chutz La'aretz? Is that the style of the Mishnah? So if you're reading, for example, Maseches Megillah, you might come across things like that say, yeah, for example, some Mishnayos in Maseches Megillah, if I could put up here, sorry I didn't put it up earlier, I'm going to put it up here for comparison. Maseches Megillah talks about not just Megillah and Purim. There's actually a lot about Torah reading, like we discussed last week. Look at this Mishnah over here. On Passover, that's the Yontif, we read Parshas Amodos Shebetoras Kohanim. By the way, it's not what we do on Passover. Tzeres Shiva Shavuot. And on Shavuos, the reading is something specific, also what we don't do anymore. Rosh Hashanah, you read this. Also what we not do anymore. Yom Kippurim. Yom Rishon Shel Chag, here's what you read. This Mishnah, as assumed by the Gemara that follows it, only tells you what you do on the first day of Yontif in Eretz Yisrael, but it doesn't give, let's say, an alternate reading, for example, on the second day of Yontif. So it doesn't address Chutz La'aretz. Or you could say, well, none of these match with what we know in Eretz Yisrael either. None of these barely match with anything we do on all these holidays, except for Yom Kippur, because it's 1 day holiday anywhere. Maybe whatever it means is that on the first day of Yontif you read this, on Passover or on Sukkot, whatever it might be, and you do the same thing on the second day. And by the way, it's still minhag in Chutz La'aretz. The one we have is here. This is the only one that's basically current of these holidays, except for Yom Kippur. On Yontif Rishon, we read Parshas Amodos in Toras Kohanim. That's an Emor. That's read on both the first day and the second day of Sukkot in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so it's probably not conclusive there. Let's stop that. Okay, let's bring back the sources over here. So let's restate the question. Is that the style of Mishnayos, just to give the state of affairs in Eretz Yisrael, like the Rosh says? But really, had the Tanaim been in Chutz La'aretz, they would have mentioned just Yom Tov Stam, Yontif Sheni. But they don't have Yontif Sheni, so they mentioned Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah. Or, like the Rambam, the sages could have mentioned Yom Tovim. They might discuss the situation in Chutz La'aretz also in the Mishnah. Except here, they're trying to make a point why they mentioned Rosh Hashanah specifically. Not because that's the only 2 day holiday with which they're familiar. It's because that's the one that the 2 days have an equal holiness status. So even though a bris might override Yontif Sheni in Chutz La'aretz, it doesn't override Yontif Sheni of Rosh Hashanah, because that's all same level as a primary holiday. Now, this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch. Which opinion does the Shulchan Aruch follow? Well, the Shulchan Aruch, the Torah said, well, the Rambam says this, but my father said that. And the Beis Yosef explained first the Rambam's opinion, but then said, but the Rosh had his own explanation for why the Rosh is Machmir. And in the Shulchan Aruch Yoredeya, which opinion is brought? The Machmir opinion. He says here, such a bris that's already a suffix, pushed off from Shabbos onto Yontif, it does not override Yontif, even the second day thereof of Yontif. Okay? So that's the Shulchan Aruch. He's Machmir like the Rosh, against the Rambam. And the Vilna Gaon here sort of flips it around. What does the Vilna Gaon do? He explains to you, in shorthand, what the Rosh's opinion is. Shulchan Aruch is following the Rosh. Yontif Sheni of Rosh Hashanah is mentioned in the Mishnah because that's the 2-day Yontif that they had. They didn't have other 2-day Yontifs. It's in Eretz Yisrael. That's where the Mishnah is. That's the Rosh. But the Vilna Gaon then points out, for whatever reason, like you pointed out earlier, what is the Vilna Gaon doing when he tells you, here's what's the basis of the Shulchan Aruch's opinion. And by the way, the Rambam holds what? That such a bris would override Yontif Sheni of Galus. What's usually the case when the Vilna Gaon does this? Just says, the Rambam's opinion doesn't even appear in the Shulchan Aruch, by the way, the lenient opinion. The Vilna Gaon explains to us the stringent opinion as found in the Shulchan Aruch, and then just tells you, and by the way, the Rambam was totally, 180 degrees the other way. He totally allowed it. The implication usually is the Vilna Gaon holds like the Rambam. Right? That's the usual thing, but to each his own. And we've discussed this with even greater scholars of the Vilna Gaon and tell us if this is an indication of Vilna Gaon's siding with the Rambam in this particular case. The nafkami would be, once again, child born twilight as Shabbos came in, and next week is Yontif Motzei Shabbos. According to the Vilna Gaon, the child would be, according to the Rambam, if it's the 3 regalim, so the child would be circumcised on Monday, Yontif Sheni. And if it's Rosh Hashanah, he would not be, according to all opinions. But according to the Rosh, even it doesn't matter. No Yontif is going to be hosting the bris milah. Is everybody on board with that so far? It's a little bit confusing. It's also a little bit difficult. I think we'll stop here after I say the next thing because slowly losing my voice. Okay. Okay, so let's see here. So the question is, once again, do the Mishnayos usually follow this general rule like the Rosh said? So where's the next time we have this idea that perhaps the Mishnah is discussing the situation in Eretz Yisrael and the situation in Chutz La'aretz? Well, the next Masechta is Eruvin. And indeed, in Eruvin, we have a relevant Mishnah right there in the 3rd parak. Actually, this is the fun parak where it has the whole thing about the fast days and other things where you can make an Eruv. Yeah, so it's one that's a little more practical. Why? Because the rest of Eruvin discuss things that people normally do. Someone else is in charge of the structure that they call the Eruv. But this one's talking about the food. And the actual food used to be the Baal Batim more in charge of that. They couldn't actually build structures on Erev Shabbos that allowed for the so-called Eruv to be functional. We're actually discussing it this week. This comes up a lot more. I'm not that machmir with Eruvin because I grew up in New York City and in Queens specifically. And there they rely on an Eruv that definitely doesn't follow the Rambam. So I was asking, wait a minute, I study the Rambam. Basically, we live in a Rosh Hashanah, or something that cannot actually be considered a Rosh Hashanah that is given for Eruvin. Yeah, there's a lot of things that don't fit the Rambam. Aside from that, he doesn't require 600,000 people to be traversing the place in order to make it a public domain. Even less people still make the place a public domain. That's a big one. And then they're discussing this one this week. The Rambam basically says that if you want to close up one of the sides of the Medina, as it is, we're not talking about just the chutzner itself or the alleyway, the mavui. What happens? Chutzner is the open, not public, but open shared area between the houses. All the houses open into the chutzner. The chutzner is basically walled in. So that's Eruvei Chatzeros. That's the most basic Eruv. And then every chutzner goes on to the street, the mavoi. And you got to put all the mavoot together. So that's shituf. And that might be good enough, but if you have them all, quite a few streets within a so-called walled city, that's called the Medina. So the city needs to be walled on most of its sides. You could have gates of the city, gateway, sorts of Pesach. So that's what they do nowadays. when they make a municipal Eruv, they don't really have walls a lot of places. Instead, they just have lots of Tzuros Pesach, and that might not necessarily work. And according to the Rambam, by the way, Tzuros Pesach for a Medina isn't just a simple, uprights and the crossbeam that the right Rambam might describe at the edge of the Mavoi or of the Chutzner. The Rambam would say that if you have a whole, let's say, town composed of many Chatzeros and Mavos, you have to actually have doors that not only can be locked when they want to, close the gates, they actually need to be occasionally locked. And most places don't have such a thing. Here at Kochav Yaakov, we have the most Mahadran Eruv, at least before they started repairing the Eruv, just a temporary measure. They were upgrading the security fence. There's an actual fence around the Yishuv, and a gate, or 2 gates, that they actually do close at night. And all Shabbos long, the gate is closed. So it fits, according to the Rambam. It's a very kosher one. There are some very wide open areas also that might harm the Eruv. The Eruv is supposed to only enclose areas that are fit for habitation. Mukaf l'dirah, it's been enclosed for habitational purposes. But if you have 2 big areas that are not meant for that, planted areas and other things, so that sort of ruins the whole deal. Either way, the point was people are discovering, wait a minute, a lot of places, they definitely cannot build an Eruv, like the way the Rambam would say. Why? Because they're lacking legitimate walls or a fence or something. Even if they have a fence, do they actually have an area that they're using for, let's say, the traffic, people coming in? Is that an official gateway that can have actual doors that can be closed? So, it's a problem. Okay, so let's get to this one. Eruvin. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rosh Hashanah she'ah yorei shematit abar. Rabbi Yehuda says, someone's worried that Rosh Hashanah might end up being 2 days. Wow, what is he talking about? Well, in the olden days, a lot of places would get notification of Rosh Hashanah the day of, or maybe a little bit thereafter. Here, Shematit Abar means he's worried it's going to be a 2-day affair, which means he's living in a place that, yes, of course it's going to be 1 day. They know that day 30 from the beginning of Elul, which they already know. Now it's already late in Elul. They're already informed when Elul began. Day 30 thereof is going to be Rosh Hashanah, at least Misafik. And the question is, maybe the day after will also be Rosh Hashanah if witnesses don't come that day 30 and declare Rosh Hashanah. Or at least allow the Sanhedrin to declare it. So he's worried about such a thing. He's looking at a potential 2-day Yontif coming. So this fellow, where is he? He's obviously not so far away in the diaspora. Why? Because they would have to assume it's a 2-day Yontif anyways. Day 30 and the next day, because they're only going to get notification sometime later. That's where the whole idea of Yontif Sheni comes up. But if he lives close enough to where he could potentially hear the news of Rosh Hashanah the day of Rosh Hashanah, so that's the reason why he's only has a concern of such a thing. So the Mishnah says he can make 2 Eruvin. Mariv Adam Sheni V'Omer. Mariv Adam Shnei Eruvin. He makes 2 Eruvin. And he says, basically stipulates, Eruvi or Rishon Lemizrach, my Eruv of the Tchum, not of Chatzeros, by the way, not a Shitu Fili Mavos. This allows him to extend where he can walk, technically, assuming he's not carrying anything, where he can go. So it basically takes his Tchum, his radius, he's going to shift it. He says, my Eruv for the first day is to the east. Actually, where I'm standing, the east is that way, sort of behind me. And west is that way. Vashini L'Marav. The Eruv I'm making for the second day is to the west, or whatever other example. Or Rishon L'Marav, Vashini L'Mizrach. Day 1 is to the west, and day 2 is to the east. Eruvi Rishon Vashini K'vei Yiri. Okay? Or my first Eruv means I'm just going to stay here. Vashini K'vei Yiri. And the second day, the first day is wherever it's going to be. Second day I'll be once again like everybody else in my town. Eruvi Ashini, or my Eruv will be for the second day. But on day 1 I'll be like everybody else. So he can make such a stipulation. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he can make such a stipulation. And the sages disagreed with him. Okay? So where is this? This is very interesting. We know that it's talking about Rosh Hashanah because it said it's Rosh Hashanah. What does Rashi say? Bagola Kamairi. He's in Chutz La'aretz. Read Rashi right there. So Rashi is saying like whom? I put it in blue here. He's basically saying that the Mishnah is discussing Rosh Hashanah in Chutz La'aretz, where they'd have 2 days. Okay? Bagula. Okay, could be. So why don't the sages disagree with him? Let's see. Let's put on our thinking caps for a second. This Mishnah certainly doesn't follow what the Rosh is saying. Why doesn't it follow what the Rosh is saying? I don't think it follows exactly the Rambam, but it cannot follow the Rosh. Why can't it follow the Rosh? Because the Rosh is the Mishnayos, over here, they talk about what? Eretz Yisrael. They're Nishnes in Eretz Yisrael, so they discuss the Eretz Yisrael type of case. In Eretz Yisrael, they have 2-day Rosh Hashanah. But they wouldn't have mentioned other days. But here, Rashi's saying this Mishnah here is talking about a Stam Mishnah, a Machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, who are in Eretz Yisrael, by the way, discussing the case where, the situation, in Chutz La'aretz. So this is already a Mishnah, shortly after the Mishnah over here in Shabbos, where Rashi himself says the Mishnah is discussing the situation in Chutz La'aretz. So it doesn't follow with the Rosh. Okay? The whatever Rashi is holding over here, he could even ask the Rosh, why did you assume, let's say, the Mishnah previously in Shabbos, just a few parakim ago, is necessarily discussing the situation in Eretz Yisrael, where we have right over here a Mishnah that's discussing Chutz La'aretz. That's not Mukhlach, by the way. This would help the Rambam, but the problem is Rambam doesn't necessarily understand this Mishnah exactly like the Rambam. Either way, what did the Chachamim do? According to the way Rashi has this, the Chachamim did not agree with Rabbi Yehuda because these 2 days of Rosh Hashanah are Kedusha Achas. That's the way Rashi has it. Okay? They don't allow this stipulating. 2-day Rosh Hashanah coming. So Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, 1 day will be like this, 1 day like that. The Chachamim don't allow such a stipulation, specifically on Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because Rosh Hashanah is like one long day, Kedusha Achas. And so how would the Rosh explain this Mishnah? Right? As we have. I have here the Rosh's explanation. He says that these Chachamim are Rabbi Yossi, who says Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, but it's all Kedusha Achas. What's going on here? When they were waiting for witnesses to come, and they didn't show up, or they came too late, so today was holy, tomorrow was holy, it's like 1 day. By the way, which means that this Kedusha Achas basically predates the modern calendar. They were having, even in times when the Sanhedrin was still sanctifying Rosh Hashanah and the other holidays, and the other Rosh Chodashim, they considered, at least according to the way the Rosh understands this, they considered the 2 days to be 1 day, one halacha. And that's the halacha according to the Rosh. And then he continues, come on. But this type of stipulation actually would work for other Yom Tovim. They're discussing Rosh Hashanah specifically because in Rosh Hashanah, that's where there's a machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda says stipulate from day to day, it changes. Chachamim say it doesn't because the 2 days are like one. But if it was some other yontif, the Chachamim would agree, yeah. Rabbi Yehuda has a good idea. If Rabbi Yehuda had mentioned yontif, not Rosh Hashanah, we would have agreed with him. So, it's a little bit tricky. 3 Rishonim, 3 understandings of the Mishnah. The Mishnah continues. Next Mishnah. This is the 8th Mishnah in the parak. Rabbi Yehuda also said, "Mafneh adam al kalkala b'yom tov rishon, v'lochla b'sheni." A person can make a stipulation concerning this basket of fruit on the first day, eat it on the second day. Sort of muktzah, it's prepared only for the second day. By the way, now he says Yom Tov Rishon. Is he still talking about Rosh Hashanah, or now he's talking about other Yom Tovim? Nechein beitza shenoda b'yom tov rishon v'yachal b'sheni. An egg laid on the first day of Yom Tov is already not nolad and not muktzah on the second day, it can be eaten. And the sages disagreed with him also on this case. They said he can't do such a thing. It basically implied that, maybe they disagree with him because, once again, we're talking about Rosh Hashanah. What's muktzah on the first day, or nolad on the first day, is also muktzah nolad on the second day. And here the Rosh says, Vilchatha kiri b'shnei yamim tovim shel galiyot, v'lo b'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah. And the halacha, the objective halacha would follow what the Rabbi Yehuda is saying if it were any yontif not Rosh Hashanah. Which is, now let's try to read this. Are we saying that the sages would agree with him? The sages, let's say, they represent the halacha. The Rosh isn't saying halacha Rabbi Yehuda. The Rosh is saying halacha kachachamim. So they disagree with him concerning Rosh Hashanah. But they would have agreed with him if it were other Yom Tovim. Okay, that's how we understand the Rosh. Either way, the Rosh here, along with Rashi, has just given away his hand. He's saying that, he's not like Rashi. He says that this Mishnah over here is talking about Rosh Hashanah specifically, but implying that the din would have been differently for in the Gullus. That's one way of understanding it. Okay? Or you could say that Rabbi Yehuda is giving the halachic position on Yom Tif, and the Chachamim here are not the halacha. I don't know. I think you could read the Mishnah both ways according to the Rosh. I don't know how you do it, but either way, Rashi is very clear that he doesn't hold of the Rosh's idea that certain Mishnayos were said specifically for Eretz Yisrael, and the Mishnayos can actually discuss situations in Chutz La'aretz. Okay. There's 2 more points that need to be made about these Mishnayos. There's 2 difficulties, although it's not so hard. It's not such a hard thing to ask. It's a kashas on the Rambam's Perush Mishnayos. That's not authoritative. The Rambam's Perush was written early, and the halachas he actually brings in the Yad Chazaka, which he edited, like Rav Kapak and others point out. There are emendations in the Perush Mishnayos, but the Yad Chazaka is meant to be the final, consummate halacha. Right? So maybe Rambam backtracked things or had different understandings later in life when he was more of an adult and wrote the Yad. Here, the Rambam says, interestingly enough, let's see here. It's interesting. Hold on. He says, one, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. That's interesting. The sages disagree with him, but he says the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? That's the first thing. What does he mean the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? So let's read it inside. Rabbi Yehuda she'aseh Yom Tisha v'esrei Elu shnei Eruvin min yirtzeh. Person on the 29th day of Elu can make 2 Eruvin. Kevan she'eno de'im yeh l'macharas Rosh Hashanah or macharat macharato. Uncertain if it's going to be day 30 or day 31 is actual Rosh Hashanah. So he wants to go either to the east, to the west, different days. So he makes a stipulation based on his needs. And that's what the permutations he gives here. And he says the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. What does he mean by the halacha is Rabbi Yehuda? Well, the Rambam would have said, how can you make such a stipulation? Later, halachic Rambam would have said, if we're talking about Rosh Hashanah, like the Mishnah said explicitly, isn't it Kedusha Achas? So how can he make these stipulations? It should be halachas like Chachamim. So he says that was then. Okay? Nowadays we have a calendar that this our modern calendar, promulgated in like the 3rd century, that's what makes it Kedusha Achas. The situation in Mishnaic times was that the 2 days of possible Rosh Hashanah was not Kedusha Achas. So why did the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda is right. We could make this stipulation. Let's show this Mishnah again. Okay? This Mishnah over here, over here. This original Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda's position, talking about stipulating different Eruvin on Rosh Hashanah, was said before the modern calendar. And as Rambam says, there wasn't only 2 different Kedushas of those days. They could make stipulations. So why do the sages disagree with him? Okay, good question. And not only that, the Rambam's basically implying, over here, let's continue. This one united Kedusha of the 2 days is like one long day. But the other Yom Tovim, in Gullus, they have 2 separate Kedushas. You can do them. All those different stipulations would be allowed on Yom Tov Sheni and Chutz La'aretz. So like I said, it's kasha on the Rambam. What were the sages holding in this Mishnah? Why they disagree then? And this is like the Rosh and others point out, it seems that this idea of Kedusha Achas on 2-day Rosh Hashanah predates our calendar. Let's say in even before Hillel's time, Beis HaMikdash times, when this was still a practical thing that could have been 2-day Rosh Hashanah, in Yerushalayim no less, that was considered Kedusha Achas. When it ended up being a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, it was like Kedusha Achas, Yom HaRichta done it. Even though the concept of Yom HaRichta is only explicit, that term only occurs in the Babylonian Talmud, sometime later, they're using this term to describe what existed well beforehand. There's a lot of Mishnaic and Talmudic terms to describe that which is already in the Mishnah, but they coined the term. Rabbi Parnas used to like saying that. That's the first problem with the Rambam. The second one is over here. How often did this happen? The Rambam tells us that 2-day Rosh Hashanah is this phenomenon there, and it used to happen in Eretz Yisrael. The Nachush said Rosh Hashanah. Why they worry about on Rosh Hashanah? Ki afilu bizman shayu osin al pi hariyah. Even when the Sanhedrin was still sitting, and they would establish the calendar based on witnesses citing the new moon, hayu osin Rosh Hashanah shnei yamim barov. They ended up keeping Rosh Hashanah as 2 days in most of the time, or most of the years. Right? That's what usually ended up. Does that fit? So that's disputed by a statement in the Talmud elsewhere, which is, Miyamot Ezra Ve'elach lo matzinu elu mu'bar. 2-day Rosh Hashanah means that Elul got extended by a day. That first day when everybody was already observing Rosh Hashanah, day 30, ended up not being Rosh Hashanah. Really, the next day was, day 31. So outgoing Elul was 30 days, and the first of Tishrei was only the 31st day. That's how most understand this, like the Rosh, for example. It was a very rare thing that they actually ended up having 2-day Rosh Hashanah. And the Chasam Sofer and others, there's a nice mimer, maybe we'll go into that next week, from the Daf Yomi people. I remember reading this almost 20 years ago. This idea that since Ezra's time, there's been a conspiracy, and now this is established in our calendar, that the Adar before Nisan, I say that because there could be potentially 2 Adars, the Adar before Nisan and Elul are always 29 days long, so that people who are aware of when Elul or Adar started already know to anticipate with high probability when Passover or Rosh Hashanah are going to be, without hearing about the establishment of the next month. If you know when Adar or Elul started, and those are going to be short months, so you know when the holiday is going to be. Yes, they were doing this, and there's ways to allow it. So they have intimidation tactics. If you know math, you can already calculate in advance when the new moons are going to show up. So the Sanhedrin knows they want Elul to be 29 days long. They could delay the start of Elul itself. If witnesses come to tell us, oh, Elul just started, we saw the new moon, they can give them all sorts of drishas and chakiras, or not accept their testimony, or some other technical loophole to make sure that Elul starts a day late. Or make it that Tammuz starts a day late. Or Av, whatever it is. There's no fixed length of those months. Because if you push off one of those months right before Elul, so Elul will start a day late. Because there's a minimum length. If Av started late, and it's already day 30 of it is coming over, whatever it might be, right? You have to say, well, I still need a day 30 of Av. I can't start Elul yet. I still need a day 29 of Av, let's say. They started it late. No, they say, but even if they did, they're not. There's no Beis Din sitting there at the end of day 28. They only start sitting at the end of day 29. Yeah, the Beis Din only accepts testimony up to a certain amount of time. Really, no, they can't. They don't do that anymore. They created limits. The Beis Din is only supposed to declare officially before the end of the day. They look at the stars, not just sunset. Like Rabbi Avi says, they actually look 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars. They're actually looking very carefully. And then they even created a takana, or in Beis Hamikdash times, we're not going to accept edus after a certain point in the afternoon. Yeah. So there were ways that the Sanhedrin had to make it work out, but it didn't always work out. They just tried to say that. Rabbi Adler wrote about this also. They were really trying hard to make sure that Elul and Adar are 29 days long. And that's why it says there's a little bit of a guzma, because if it was always Mimos Ezra Va'ilach, Lo Matzinu Elul Me'ubar, we never had a 30-day Elul, that's a little bit of exaggeration because it's clear from the sources that sometimes it did happen. That's why they had this 2-day Rosh Hashanah. The Rambam, I think following the Rif, assumed that 2-day Rosh Hashanah and Elul Me'ubar happened much more often than, let's say, this Gemara allows for it. The Rambam says, Rove. Most years, you ended up with 2-day Rosh Hashanah, which means a 30-day Elul. But here, The Mishnah, the Gemara in a few places say, no, it never happened. And they say Elul, they say never with a little bit of a guzma, but still. This Rambam, that Rove, he says most of the time it happened this way, is a little bit difficult. It's like I said, it's one of the two difficulties, the three, that's in this Perush of Mishnayos. And I think the Rambam moderated his tone. Yeah, please.
Is it Rov HaZman or Rov HaMekomot? Because according to the second option, then the Rambam makes sense. In most places, they did keep Shnei Yamim.
Okay, fine. So yeah, you could say the Shnei Yamim Barov. This, by the way, I wonder how was it translated from Arabic. Maybe I have the Arabic here. Well, look over here. I'm going to show you something in Mishnah Torah that would actually shed light on this question. Where you say, I'm saying Rove is most years. You're saying Rove is most places. Okay? So let's look over here. Ela filu b'Yerushalayim atzma shehu instead of shehu mekom beitin. Pamim rabot hayu osim yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah shnei yamim tovim. Many times they would make Rosh Hashanah 2 days. Even that's where the Beis Din was. Shim lovo edim kol yom shloshim. If witnesses didn't come up the entire day 30, whatever reason. Noagim hayu b'otho hayom shemitzapim leidim kodesh u'machar kodesh. That day was considered a holiday, and the next day they were hoping the witnesses show up. Oh, no witnesses. Okay, tomorrow's also a holiday. And since they did Rosh Hashanah 2 days, even when they were establishing the calendar based on sightings, they made a takana that when even now we're establishing the calendar based on calculations, there's no suffix anymore. Still in Eretz Yisrael, they should keep 2 days. That's the takana. This is a history that's disputed, by the way, by the Balamor and others, and Rabbi Bar-Hayim, for example. Right? It says it. Everything. There's a lot of evidence we have that this is not a takana. It's actually much later. It's medieval, and it wasn't the practice in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, they have 1 day Rosh Hashanah. By the way, here the Rambam says it differently. He's talking about Rosh Hashanah in Yerushalayim itself. But this is, I guess, a proof to what Leon's saying. He says, Rosh Hashanah, in the old days, Hayu Rov B'nai Yisrael Osino To Shnei Yamim Tovim Misafek. Okay? Rosh Hashanah ended up being a 2-day affair. Okay? Every day. Basically that. It doesn't even say Rov. Okay? Rov B'nai Yisrael would do a 2-day Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because they're not going to hear it anyways. But maybe they would. If the witnesses came early enough on Rosh Hashanah morning, they would have a way of getting the word out, even, as early in the night. Let's say they didn't start lighting the fires, let's say, right? Sending out people on horseback. They declared Thursday morning, it's already Rosh Hashanah. So already the second evening, people aren't observing Rosh Hashanah. They're lighting the fires, or they're having that's before not the Karaites. The Samaritans intervened and ruined everything. What they would start having horseback messengers. So it wasn't most of the places that they were doing 2-day yontif of Rosh Hashanah Misafek every single year. Some years they did. But the Rambam, basically, his language is sort of saying that they did it more often than I would want to believe based on that line of the Gemara, Lo matzinu elo me'ubar. It was a rare thing. Rarely. But the Rambam has it that they did a lot more. Okay? So it's, I don't know. I'm a little bit, I don't know. If I were the Rambam, I don't know what I would do, but still, maybe I would have written it differently in the Perush of Mishnayos. And I guess that's all we have for there. But these two Mishnayos certainly have a lot to show us. So, restatement of this. Just because there's an opinion in the Tanaim, it doesn't mean we need to find an explicit teaching of the Gemara. It says we rejected his opinion. There was a tiyufta brought. Okay? Sometimes there's just other factors and other Mishnayos, stam Mishnayos, that imply that no, we don't hold that way. Or sometimes we have other opinions come in there. Not every single. There are many opinions in all the Mishnahs, and the Rambam says Allah is not like them. And a lot of times, just say that wasn't the majority opinion. That was a rejected opinion, and the Gemara doesn't have to tell you why it was rejected. Right? Yeah. Or you could even say something's a good argument. There's a Mishnayos there. Rabbi Gamliel felt like this. Oh, it's a good argument. Yeah, but it's not halacha. What are you going to do? Okay, so we'll stop there. Sorry, we're not going to go into Sefer Avoda, but I don't think I can handle it anymore. So we'll close with the prayer, and we live to see the destruction of Israel's enemies, rebuilding the temple, and reestablishment of temple service speedily. And have a Shabbat Shalom, V'nisachon.